Hi sixth graders, this is Mrs. Gall. Today I'm going to remind you of some integer rules when adding and subtracting that you can apply to decimal operations. Let's get started with an example like this. -3 42 plus -1 2/10. A reminder that when we're adding two negatives, we add just like we would two positives, but our answer stays a negative because we're combining negatives together. Since we're adding decimals, we want to make sure that we continue to line up the decimals in this process. So I'm going to stack my -3 42 with -1 2/10 below, lining up my decimals, placing a 0 in as any place value holders. 2 plus 0 gives us 2, 4 and 2 gives us 6, drop the decimal into my answer, 3 and 1 gives us 4. We were adding two negatives, so we end with a negative answer. We also might see problems where we have one positive and one negative that are being added together. In these types of problems, remember that our positives and negatives are actually canceling each other out, so even if it looks like it's an addition problem, we're going to subtract. For example, -24 8/10 plus 10 41/100. Here's an example where I have a negative integer and a positive integer. Even though I'm adding, these are going to end up canceling each other out when we have a negative and a positive being added together, so we're actually going to subtract. I'm going to place my larger number on top and subtract my smaller number by lining up the decimals. I'm going to add a 0 as a place value holder, and now I subtract following normal subtraction rules. 0 minus 1, I would borrow from my 8, it becomes a 7, so my 0 becomes a 10. I get 9, 3, drop the decimal, 4, and 1. Now we have to ask ourselves, does a positive or a negative answer make more sense? Well, we had more negatives in the problem because -24 8/10 is a larger absolute value. That means you're going to have more negatives left over. So I got -14 39/100. I also want to talk through some of our subtraction rules because those we have a very special rule that we apply to subtraction problems, and sometimes it helps to refresh that one. Once we apply that rule, then we have to keep these addition rules in mind. Let's try -14 9/10 minus a -3 2/10. When we have a subtraction problem with integers, that's when we apply our rule, add the opposite. So we change our subtraction to addition and take the opposite of the second number. In this case, it was a negative, so it switched to a positive. Anytime we're subtracting with negative numbers, we can add the opposite. Now it turns into an addition problem, which is just like the one we solved, a negative plus a positive. When we have a negative plus a positive, they're going to cancel each other out, so we're actually going to subtract. I make sure I line up my decimals. I get 7, 1, and 1. Now I need to ask myself, is this a positive or a negative 11 7/10? Well, our larger number is a negative, so it's going to be a -11 7/10. Let's try one more together before I have you try a couple on your own. (6 1/10) plus a -2 4/10. Make those decimals a little bit bigger. When we are adding a negative, what does that mean to do? Hopefully you said it means to subtract. So if I wanted to add a negative, I'm actually subtracting. I line up my decimals and can complete that subtraction. 1 minus 4, we would need to borrow from our 6, make it a 5. That gives my 1 a group of 10, so it's 11. 11 minus 4 is 7. Drop the decimal. 5 minus 2 is 3. I have more positives in the start of my problem, so my answer is a positive 3 7/10. Let's try a few on your own. Sorry, my eraser takes a while here. Try this one on your own. 11 8/10 plus a negative 3 17/100. Pause the video, and when you're ready, press play to see the answer. Alright, you guys, hopefully adding a negative, you remembered that that meant to subtract, so you line up your decimals and go ahead and subtract those two integers. I borrow from the 8, make it a 7, so that 0 becomes a 10. I subtract and get 3, 6, drop the decimal, and 11 minus 3 gives us 8. So we get 8 63/100. It's a positive because I had more positives in the start of my problem. Let's try one more before you try your independent practice today. Let's try a subtraction problem this time. Let's try negative 25 18/100 minus a negative 4 3/10. Go ahead and pause and try this one on your own. When you're ready, press play. A reminder that we want to add the opposite when subtracting, and then negative 25 18/100 plus 4 3/10, I will actually still subtract because those are going to cancel each other out, the positives and the negatives. When I set up subtraction, I line up my decimals. 8 minus 0 is 8. 1 minus 3, I need to borrow to make that happen. Add a group of 10. 11 minus 3 is 8. 4 minus 4 is 0. And 2 minus 0 is 2. Make that decimal a little bit more well known. 20 88/100. But do I have more positives or negatives in my start of my problem? I have more negatives. So I'm going to have negatives left over, negative 20 88/100. All right, guys, go ahead and try your independent practice. Check in with your teacher if you have any questions.